Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to start by acknowledging these fine conventions. The Hellmouth Con. The Hellmouth Convention is back, and it's hosting a spectacular event in the place of all places, Torrance High School, the shooting location for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Join us June 15th, 2024 for one day only. Proceeds benefit the Los Angeles LGBT Center and the Ron Glass Memorial Scholarship. Visit thehellmouth.org for details. SoonerCon 32. Oklahoma City's longest-running premier pop culture convention returns June 21st through 23rd, 2024. Prepare for 3 days of cosplay, crafts, tabletop gaming, and legendary guests, all in the friendly town of Norman, Oklahoma. To give back to the community, fundraisers and a live charity auction will be held. Visit SoonerCon.com to reserve your membership.
Hello there, and welcome to this live recording of the Hungry Trilobyte podcast. My name is Aaron Bossig. I'm going to be your host. And for people who might not be familiar with the show, Hungry Trilobyte is all about fandom and how it makes our lives better, how creativity makes our lives better. And I'm guessing that there's not anybody in this building right now who hasn't felt that in some way, whether they're into gaming or they're into Star Trek or they're into Marvel, DC, Disney. They've found something there that makes their lives better. And sometimes that actually takes us to a point where we want to make something on our own. My guest today here is James Maxey. He is a sci-fi author. And the book of his I've read, he's a very prolific author. He's written a lot of things, but he's written Life in a Moment, which is a collection of short stories.
Yes. So I've had more short stories than I can count published in things like Asimov's magazine, lots of anthologies, and so every 5 or 6 years or so I'm gathering together my stories and putting them out into collections. Life in a Moment is my third short story collection, and it's been selling pretty well since I released it on October 1st. And what is amazing about this book in this day and age, whenever my first short story collection came out, I did it through a small press, and there was probably about an 18-month period between me deciding we were going to have a book come out and actually having the book come out. Here, I decided early in October that it was time for me to put together my next short story collection, and I was selling this book at a show the first weekend in November. So the modern ability to conceive of a book and have that book as a physical product in your hand in a timeline of mere weeks is kind of an age of miracles and wonder.
There was a whole conversation around just how many tools the average independent author has at their disposal now compared to even just 5 years ago. The game has completely changed, that like you said, you can have a physical product in your hand right away to get to anybody who might want that. It's the ability to change is, can you write the book and can you market it?
Yeah, and so here, since it's a short story collection, I'm already being paid for these short stories as I go along. So I'll earn $500 to $900 for a short story sold to a pro magazine, but you can only get in 1 or 2 or maybe 3 stories a year to these magazines paying the pro rates. There's only a limited number of slots available, and a lot of people competing for those slots. So one of the nice things today is, it used to be I would write a short story, I'd get paid for it, and maybe I would get it reprinted once or twice, and that would pretty much be the death of that story. But now that I can put a book in, now I can put these collections into print, I can continue earning revenue from them year after year in a way that just wasn't possible 20 years ago. Where you had to have a press willing to put out your work, and there, if you had a book that only sold 50 to 100 copies a year, it was going to be a flop for that press. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I sell 100 copies a year of a book in print, it's quite worth the effort for me. It's pretty much pure profit at the since I've already got the stuff written, so it's kind of a no-brainer to write the short stories and get them collected.
And what you're outlining here is the fact that, up until that point, you're saying people who write short stories for a living are not necessarily in the same group of people that eat off of gold plates and bathe in Perrier.
No. The last person who really lived off of short stories was probably Harlan Ellison.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to make money as a writer, if you're writing for media, if you can become a screenwriter or writing for some scripted medium, that's a good path. But if you're wanting to write prose fiction, pretty much novels are kind of a requirement if you want to have any hope of paying your mortgage.
But what I like about this book in particular is that the stories have a very Twilight Zone type of feel to them.
Yeah.
And you're saying it's an introduction to darkness, which is that they're very morbid in tone.
They're dark. All of them are people confronting their mortality, or people confronting the fact that they had a vision for life that isn't necessarily the life, the way that their life has turned out to be. And I try to craft each story to where there's a moment of hope, where there is the characters. I'm following the characters into the darkness, but I'm trying to show that maybe there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, to use a completely original phrase that no one has used before.
And since this is a collection, I'm assuming you didn't write all the stories with that connecting thread in line there. You just kind of decided after the fact that, oh, hey, this works as a set.
Yes. So this turned out to be a fairly tightly themed book. I didn't realize, most of these stories I've written months apart, sometimes years apart. But one of the consistent themes in here are stories about people who are losing their memories. They're hitting an age where they are kind of losing the ability to remember all the details of their life. And once you start forgetting your life, is it still your life? And so there's a story in here called Clockwork Melting that will be reprinted in the next edition of the year's best hard science fiction, about a guy who is, trying to recreate his entire life as a clockwork sculpture on Venus. And I don't want to spoil the story, but just this, he's trying to, get a grasp on his own life by walking through this sculpture garden, where he can kind of relive, the significant moments of his life and how he comes to have a relationship with that, and what he decides to do with those memories is kind of a key to the story.
I'm not in the business of giving out spoilers. You just actually mentioned more than I would have, but what I like about that story is I would describe it as a way of a person building a sculpture and they don't even know why anymore, but they just feel so compelled to finish it.
Right, and it's again about the artistic journey, that he's making a sculpture and he's forgotten why he was inspired to make the sculpture. I can be in the middle of a book, and every author has hit a moment when they are 15 chapters into a book and they're like, why am I writing this book? Why did I start it again? There's always a point where the inspiration is going to leave you, and you're just left with the mechanical slog of, for me, writing one word, writing another word that makes sense, following with another sentence, and the spark is gone, and you just have to rely on craft and trust that whatever was in there is still in there, and it's going to reemerge as you kind of press forward through the darkness.
And conversely, I'm sure you've had the experience where you get 2/3 of the way into a project and then you get an idea that will let you go.
Oh,
and
yeah.
You have to get that out. It's like a sneeze. It's got to come out now.
Yeah, well, I've tossed aside 50,000 words or more because I will be well into a project and realize, oh wait, I've done something wrong. So I've got a book in my Bitterwood series. The prequel novel in here is called Dawn of Dragons, and I wrote the book where the primary hero was kind of this government secret agent who was, kind of this rugged guy who is good with guns and good with his fists, and he's on this mission, to help me respond to an alien invasion. And after I wrote the 50,000 words of that book, I was like, yeah, this is not who I need to have. I don't need a competent person, a heroic figure at the middle of this. This is reading too much like I've watched too many action movies. And so I went back, and instead the protagonist that I wrote on the second draft, complete opposite. He's a veterinarian who treats test animals for the military, and the military is sending monkeys through this warp door that they've created that's taking them instantaneously between two laboratories, but sometimes the monkeys go missing, and they disappear, and they never come out. And his guilt about doing this has had him sort of sampling the wares, and so he's now gotten himself a little drug addiction going on with the horse tranquilizers, and he's kind of this wastrel, not happy. No way is he involved, the sort of person who carries a gun or gets into fist fights.
Guns and horse tranquilizers don't mix very well.
Yeah, no, but it turned out, he was the hero I needed. He was the protagonist that I had to have go through the story, and being able to say, okay, the 2 months I've spent writing 50,000 words, they weren't wasted, but they're delete. They're gone, and I'm starting fresh with the new protagonist.
Mm-hmm. It's the old phrase, kill your darlings. I mean, just because you worked hard on something doesn't mean that you can't get rid of it if it serves a story.
Right. You gotta be willing to, if you want to write, the most important key is the delete key.
And that scary thing is just looking at that blank page and not knowing what the first thing that's going to go on it is. Once you get past that point, everything else starts to flow at least a little bit.
Right.
Maybe slowly, but it flows.
Yeah, just it's I have a writing book, and the subtitle is Daydream Type Repeat, and I try to demystify the process so you can get caught up, you can get hung up on so many things you've got to do as a writer. All the characters you got to keep straight. The plot has to make sense. You got to have the world building and the continuity, and it can get very stressful trying to keep all these balls in the air. But at the end of the day, all you're doing is daydreaming and typing it out. It's not rocket science. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it just comes down to remembering that the worst page that you ever type out is more readable than the greatest page you're carrying around in your head. It's okay if your first draft is a mound of radioactive waste, mm-hmm. because when you're around radioactive waste, that's where you get your superpowers.
It's funny you should say that, because I actually had a bit of a revelation last month when I was in the middle of 2 big deadlines, and I just had to say to myself, you can't edit a blank page.
Right.
You can't edit a blank page.
No.
You can't edit a blank page. And yet, I realize, I look in the mirror, and every morning I expect to wake up with the superpower of being able to edit a blank page. I never learned that lesson.
Well, it is easier to write once you have your superpowers, and the second draft is where you have superpowers. When you're in your first draft, you're kind of typing blind, you're fumbling your way forward. By the time you're on your second draft, you've got telepathy. You know what people are thinking. You have telekinesis. You can pick things up from one chapter and place them in another chapter. You have time travel. If you get to a scene where the hero needs a sword, to kill the dragon, you can go back to the first chapter and have him find that sword. And so, the main reason to write the first draft is to get the superpowers you need to write the second draft, which is going to be the one that shines.
And, I mean, people will, especially at the beginning, say, I just read my first draft and it sucks.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's allowed to suck. You're allowed to suck. That's okay.
Yeah, totally.
That's what the next draft is for, to make it less sucky.
Yeah, I go through about 6 drafts for every book I write. So I have my first draft, which is the putting the clay on the wheel. I've got to get it down. I've got to get the raw materials to turn into something. It's the second draft where I really make that clay look like something, and then each additional draft is putting on the glaze and getting it fired. And so, every draft gets you a little bit closer to the final product, but you got to start with some ugly clay.
And you got to find a point at which you can just say, this is going to ship the way it is.
Yeah. Give yourself a deadline. That is the hardest part of me now being, so I worked with publishers for years. So up until about from 2003 to 2011, all the books I had were traditionally published. And one of the good advantages of being traditionally published was you did have deadlines. So you had to have, your story in by a certain point, and those deadlines could be a real juice to your creativity. I've got to get this done. So it'd help you prioritize. Whereas now, I don't have the same deadlines. I can say, I want to get this out by such and such date. But it's very tempting to be able to go, I think I need 2 or 3 more months to polish it to the next level. And sometimes you need those 2 or 3 more months. But eventually you just got to say, all right, I'm putting it up for pre-order. It's coming out on this date, and it's going to be good. I could make it better if I spend another year, but it's going to be plenty good enough. People are going to love it.
Perfection is the mirage you keep chasing.
Yes. Yeah, there's no point. And if you are chasing perfection, you're just never going to hit it. And the reality is, every story you read, every story that you've ever heard of that's famous has some flaw to it. So I read a lot of classic literature, and I'll constantly encounter great books trapped inside of terrible books. So the classic example of this is Les Miserables, Victor Hugo, which has this fantastic plot about a prisoner who convicted for stealing bread for his family, and him trying to live a good life while being hounded by the law. It's a wonderful plot, deep characters, and then there's hundreds and hundreds of pages about the Parisian sewers and how they were built and how they were planned and how the city is kind of requires them. And it's this kind of treatise on urban planning, from that era. And it's like, this seems like he's kind of lost the thread here.
Yeah, and in older books, and especially, you'll find that there's these tendencies to go off on tangents in ways that modern audiences really wouldn't tolerate. And I can never decide if that's good or bad.
It's, so something like Moby Dick, the tangents are the novel. You are reading it and you get kind of frustrated by why he keeps going and writing one essay after another about whales, and he seems to have forgotten that there were characters in the book. But he's documenting a reality. You read a lot of fantasy novels now where the authors get really tied up in the world building, and you're wanting to find out the little cities and who the governor of this province is and what the local lore and legends are, and it's all texture and it's all very rich and promising. And when you encounter it in a fantasy novel, it can seem really, really important if you handle it well. And for something like Moby Dick, this is his world building. Mm-hmm. It's just he's describing something that really was in the world. And I've learned to love these long essays that sneak into some of these older books.
There are a lot of gems in there, I will admit.
Yeah.
And then there's the other side of the coin that I'll throw out there. Okay, no shade on anybody who loves this book, but the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad.
Oh my God.
Okay, not a fan. And it's like we want to talk about the world building aspects, and it's like this dude spent 2 pages talking about the fog. The fog was gray, and this book sucks. Okay.
Yeah.
But,
Well,
okay.
so Heart of Darkness, I will defend Heart of Darkness as it's actually a fairly short book.
It
you
is.
know. So there's a lot of detail in it. It's a lot of words to say a fairly concise little statement about corruption, but at least it's something that if you're an energetic reader, you can read it in a weekend, possibly less, versus something like War and Peace or Les Miserables, where you could be locked into this for months.
So how many books total in both novels and short stories have you had published?
I have had probably about 25 books published, and then short stories I've really lost count. It's got to be in the 60s or 70s, if not yet 100.
So let's say a safe number is 80 total.
Yeah.
Okay. Of that 80, is there anything you can think of, and you don't have to name a title, just say yes. Is there anything that you've said, man, I wish I hadn't shipped that the way it is. I needed another draft.
No, but not everything that I've published is some sparkling gem. I'm constantly surprised by that I will stumble across something that I forgot I've written.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a story called Earl Billings and the Angels of the Lord that appeared in an anthology probably around 2002, and a guy at World Fantasy Convention came up to me and was like, "Oh, I remember your story about the terrorist who meets the angels," and I'm like, "What? You've got to have me confused by some other, I don't think I've ever written that story." And he's like, no, it was in the anthology. There was like a woman in silver on the cover, and I'm like, oh wait, I do remember an anthology like that. And so yeah, I had to actually go onto Amazon and look it up and find out why. Yes, he was remembering a story that I had written that I completely forgot having written and published.
So the bottom line is, at some point, even when you think, man, I should do another rewrite, when you actually get it out there and it's off in the world and it's finding its audience, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's the kid that got off to college, okay?
Yeah. Everything you write, you'll have someone out there who's going to encounter it and think, oh, I really connect with this. So, there's nothing that you're wasting your time writing. Somewhere out there is the perfect reader for every story. There will be true love between the reader and the work, and it's just your duty is to have that faith that someone out there is going to love that story even after you've long forgotten it.
In an earlier episode, I talked to Elsinore, who was with Archive of Our Own, the big archive of fan fiction on the internet, which we've always had a certain commentary on fan fiction that it's just not good writing, which is not true, or that it's not worthy writing, which is not true. And it's like, no, sometimes the audience needs to be you. You just need to play with the idea and see if somebody else wants to hear it too. Yeah,
I mean, your first reader is always yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Write something you enjoy reading. If nothing else, I've written my first published novel was called Nobody Gets the Girl. It's a superhero novel, and I wrote it in 45 days. So this was before NaNoWriMo became a thing where people would challenge themselves to write a book in 30 days. I was part of a writers group, and we, me and about 6 other authors, were like, well, we're going to start on this date, and we're all going to finish a book in 45 days. And it was me and 2 other authors who actually completed it. And I had planned to write a story about Venus being terraformed, which actually is the Clockwork Melting is the bones of that story. And I thought I could. It's hard science fiction. There's a market for hard science fiction. I think I could sell this story. And was taking notes, really had the story planned out. And then the day before the contest, I had a dream. And in this dream, there was like a woman in a superhero costume, and she was sliding along like a railroad track, and she had spikes shooting out of her ankles. And I have no idea what these symbols mean, what it interprets to, but I woke up thinking about a superheroine called Railblade, and I remember also in the dream there was like an invisible man who was chasing after her, but he couldn't be seen or heard, and so I'm like, I'm going to write this weird dream I had down, and I have no idea where it's going or what it does, and no one is publishing superhero fiction. But it's something that I feel, and I was a big comic book nerd, and I just felt like I had something to say from all these superhero mythos that I had absorbed over the years. And so I took a chance. I wrote a book that I wanted to read. I thought no one else in the world would fall in love with it, but when an editor later asked me to submit a story to him, I sent him that manuscript, and he read it. He said he hit a scene in it that was so shocking he had to put it down. He said, well, I can't publish this because there's a very violent act that happens in the middle of the book. And then he said the next morning he woke up and he had been thinking about that scene all night. And he says, well, I've got to publish this. I mean, all the stories I've read in Slush, this is the first one that has kept me awake at night, thinking about it. So.
Yeah, you can't deny that. If it's sticking with somebody, it's going to have an impact on the audience, too.
Yeah. And so, fortunately, at the time, the book had a really kind of stupid ending. But he was like, he saw the value of the book, and he told me, you gotta fix this ending. And he didn't suggest how to fix it, but I could see, that the ending felt very tacked on. And so I went back and came up with a very different ending that was both kind of a penance for the characters for the sins they committed, and yet also sort of a hopeful way forward. So kind of to thread that needle where it's not either rewarding someone for doing something bad or else, just this sad, everybody's been punished ending.
And the fact that you'd had the manuscript sitting around for a couple of months, you were probably able to approach it with a fresher perspective.
Yeah. So time is the greatest editor, so it's good that now I could write a book and have it out quickly. But one of the things that was kind of an advantage of the old way of publishing, where there would be years between the project and you actually seeing it in print, was you did have a point where a year later, after you'd finished the manuscript, you might go back and think, I've really thought of a better ending to this story, and you could still go back and fix it before it hit print. Whereas now, if I write a book, I'm not going to sit around for a year before I put it out. I've got mortgages to pay.
There's a very, very prolific author with a very, very large Twitter following who shall remain nameless, who's has suggested that when you finish your first draft, you should put it in the desk and not look at it for at least 6 weeks. Do you think that's excessive, or do you think that's fair?
No, I think 6 weeks is a pretty decent. If he had said 6 months, that would be a little bit harsh. 6 years would be foolish, but yeah, no, six weeks is a pretty natural time. You got plenty of other stuff to do. Mm-hmm. I never just finish one draft and jump into the next draft. I'll normally finish a draft and then let it sit around for a month or two before I return to it, just to have that fresh eyes. It's just I no longer have. So on some of the first books I had published, before I had contracts, I would write a book and be shopping it around for years, and you could submit something to a publisher, and they might hold on to it for 2 years, and then you get it back, you get the rejection, and it's time to submit it again, but now you've had 2 years to think about it, and so you have to go back and rewrite it one more time, polish it, tweak some seeds, improve it a little bit. So that is definitely kind of a process that is disappearing in today's world, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not going to judge.
Okay. I want to ask you something else, but before I do, since we're getting down to the middle of the program here, does anybody in the audience have a question for James?
Yeah. So you're asking how to get to finishing a novel from once you start it, how do you get to the end? All right. So the primary thing to do is the biggest mistake that I made when I was first starting was I would write 3 chapters and then change my mind and go back and start all over again. And I would keep writing the first 1 to 6 chapters and never be able to get past that because new ideas would constantly come up and I hadn't planned enough. Eventually, you have to hit a stage where you give yourself permission to write it wrong. You'll have a better idea and you have to get up and write the next chapter as if you had incorporated that better idea all along. So Bitterwood, there's a character in here that started in the book as a 12-year-old boy, and I was writing. I just needed this character as kind of as a sidekick to another character, and I was looking at the timeline and realizing, 12 is too young because I'm talking about events that happened. I've already established that it's 20 years, so this kid at best is going to be like 19. And so the next scene, I was writing it then as a 19-year-old. I didn't go back and fix that. And then I was like, I've got it as a boy, but I don't have enough female characters in this section of the book, so I'm going to change it to his daughter instead of his son. And so the character kept evolving, and I just kept letting it evolve, and I didn't worry about going back and fixing it. If I had tried to go back and fix it every time, you got to give yourself permission to write it wrong so that when you hit the end and you go back, you have a better vision. You sort of have to discover the book as you move forward. And so the main motivation that I would say to keep it going is you aren't going to be able to read it until you write it. There's a famous political quote where Nancy Pelosi said something about a bill. We have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. You got to write the book to find out what's in it. I hate that my advice basically comes down to just keep typing, but just keep typing.
Sir?
All right. Okay, sorry. Oh. All right, so my schedule involves playing a lot of Sudoku and online Scrabble for many, many hours of the morning while I'm thinking about I should really be writing something. And then I will have a furious burst of activity from in the afternoon where I will crank out 1,000 to 4,000 words. But I have a superpower that is also my greatest vulnerability, which is when I have to, I can put my butt in the chair and crank out 15,000 words a day. And so I've got a couple of books where I wrote the first draft in under a week. And once you're aware that you can write an entire first draft in under a week, it kind of gives your brain this permission to, waste away the rest of the time. So for me, in my writing book, there's a picture in here of the Grim Reaper on one of the pages, and I encourage people to tear that page out and tape it above their desk. Because for me to get to where I'm writing stuff, I sometimes have to remind myself deeply about my own mortality and the fact that the book's not going to be written if I get hit by a bus. And so I've got to sit down, put my butt in the chair, and get it out. So basically, I'm a binge writer where I can go 2 or 3 months without doing anything significant, but then we'll have just a week where I'm close myself off from the world, don't look at the internet, and just furiously type. And the books I get that way, my cryptid book, which I'm down to like 4 copies of it when I came here. I wrote that in a week, but I knew I've been studying cryptids my whole life. I've been reading all about them. I just sat down and I knew I was going to do 14 cryptids. I just wrote 2 chapters a day for 7 days and I had a book. I have a superhero novel, supervillain novel called Burn Baby Burn, where the first book had been with a publisher that went bankrupt. And so my rights were tied up for 7 years. And so I kept thinking about the story, but there was no point in trying to write a sequel to a book where I didn't have the rights to the first book. And then the rights came back to me, and I walked into work one day. I now write full time, but back then I still had a day job, and my boss said, "Hey, you can go home." There was like smoke in the break room, and apparently the whole building is wired wrong, and we have to shut down for a week while the whole building is rewired according to the fire department. And so I'm driving home, and I've got a week with nothing planned. Can I write that book that I've been thinking about for 7 years? And so I would get up every morning at 7 a.m. I would keep my butt in the chair until 7 p.m. And I would get out between 9,000 to 12,000 words a day. And at the end of a week, I had the full manuscript. And to this day, it is the book that is the most like, where the final published draft is the most like the first draft. Because doing it that tightly, doing it that quickly, I never lost the thread of the story. The characters showed up. If you only write 1,000 words here on a Monday, and you come back on a Wednesday to write 2,000 words, the character voices can be gone. So for me, the binge writing works out pretty well. In probably February or March, I'm going to set aside a week where I'm going to knock out about 45,000 words on my next big work of fiction, and I know that if I can I've got the core concepts, and I just need to build up momentum. Momentum matters. It is, the great secret. So if you're the sort of, but one last thing, I will say there is no wrong way to do it though. I'm a binge writer, but I can't think of the author's name. He writes a series for Bain Books where he has an intelligent killer drone named Lobo, but he writes 500 words a day, every day. 500 words is his goal, and he puts out a couple of books a year doing that process, and that's the only. He says he couldn't even imagine doing it any other way. That is how he has to approach it. It's just that discipline of sitting down for an hour, getting out 500 good words. He doesn't really try to go back and redraft either. He tries to make it perfect as he goes along, whereas I'm very happy to throw away, get it onto the page, fix it later. There is no wrong way to do it as long as you are doing it.
There is a microphone
Okay.
back here. If anybody
Thank you.
did have any more questions, you're more than welcome. Yep, you can come.
Go ahead.
Oh, microphone, wonderful.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I have a question. So I've always wanted to write a book. I have a huge imagination, and I can sit and develop a whole book, like basically in my mind kind
Right.
of thing. Where I get, and I've tried to write before, where I get tangled up is trying to take everything that's like going through my head down one letter at a time, basically. So, I'm writing this like, it's like I got to get this done, because all of this is in my head. I want to get it on paper. So how do I slow that down?
All right. So the term here that you're going to need is point of view. So you have this infinite landscape of your world and your plot to play with, but everything has to happen here and now for one character in a scene. You could have a book where you have multiple characters, but I find it very helpful to know whose eyes I am viewing the scene from. what they know, what they don't know. And once you have that filter, it's the lens of the camera that you are seeing the world through, and you can only reveal what they know. And if they don't know something, they can ask a question, they can get an explanation, and the reader is now receiving that explanation with it. So point of view is 90% of the trick of learning to write a scene. And going back to the film analogy, whenever you're looking at these shots, if you go and you start kind of breaking down movies, they'll have establishing shots where they're like showing a street in a neighborhood, and then they show a specific front door, and they kind of are going in, and that's kind of this kind of cinematic way that you're getting from a big picture deeper and deeper in. You got to be able to have that one character be your camera that is taking you deeper into the story, and that one character is the only one that you can hear their thoughts. So that's the main key is to pick which character is your camera and your storyteller, even if it's not first person. I sometimes will write first person where one character is narrating it, but if they're not, one scene at a time for one character at a time.
James, I want to thank you for that, and we're getting close to the end of our time here, but we'll make sure people can follow your adventures and find out where to follow those adventures on the table there.
Okay. So I've got some business cards up here if anybody needs a business card. I am in the aisle here at the end of the Artist Alley around aisle 600. I'm just beneath the big banner that says Artist Alley. If you are interested in my writing book, when I came here, I only had 4 copies left on the table. The same with my cryptid book. I think I was down to 4 copies of it. Life in a Moment, I still have maybe 8 or 9 copies of. And my top-selling works are actually my dragon novels. So if you like reading about dragons, I've got a grim and gritty post-apocalyptic America conquered by dragons for Bitterwood. And I've got a more sword and sorcery D&D inspired Bad Girls Battling Big Dragons for my Dragon Apocalypse series.
And for the benefit of people listening on the internet, where can they find you on the web?
So you can just type in James Maxey on Amazon, or I do have a website, jamesmaxey.net, that is updated once or twice a year. Usually if I put out a new book, within 6 months, I'll make a link to it on that website. But Amazon is basically where the real action takes place. So
I want to thank you all for being here and for listening to us and for taking this journey with us, Fan Expo New Orleans. You can follow me on the web at Aaron Bossig. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast you're listening to right now, I've got cards available for you or at my booth over there.